All right, what's up, everybody? So, in the year 2025, it's very common for everybody to view lifting as this very science oriented pursuit, when in reality, in my personal belief, and through 10 years of training myself, I do believe it is much more of an art form than it is science. So, I'm going to go through all of my points for this, and I'm going to make my case the best that I possibly can. Before I get into the video, I have to give a shout out to Barbell Apparel. It's the final week for their free hoodie sale. If you haven't heard already, you spend 99 bucks, get a free hoodie with any order at $99 or more, and it continues to stack. You can also check out Boost Camp, which is where you can access all of my programs paid or free. So there's a program for everybody. Link in my description for either of them. In today's video, I want to make the case of why lifting is still much more of an art form than it is a science. When I first started lifting, the fitness industry had taken off from a blue-collar, hardcore, but level-headed community into an anxious, pretentious, and condescending industry when it's all said and done. I was there when science-based was used for the first time in a title, and after that, there was no looking back. Luckily, I had already had some lifting experience under my belt, and I was comfortable enough with my basic understanding of training to continue to trust myself to keep making progress. However, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want a science-based explanation laid out on a platter for me. Who wouldn't want that? Back in 2016, there were tons of mainstream hypotheses for not only how to train, but how the actual process of muscle growth occurred. I've mentioned this before, but I don't blame people for overthinking their training. It's easy to make fun of beginners or lifters stuck in a plateau for overanalyzing things when you're already at your goal physique. You've got nothing to stress about since you've made it to the other side. You guessed right on which style of training will get you there, but I vividly remember being a beginner. Not only are you worried about maximizing progress, you're also worried about wasting time and energy. It's easy for me to sit here and say, I'm comfortable doing a multi-month experiment on something that might not work because I'm already, for the most part, where I want to be. But when you're just starting out, going to the gym is a culture shock for most people, and you have to do things right if you want to have success long term. Of course, this isn't the case for everyone, but for a lot of people, giving up isn't out of the question if they're not successful off the bat. It's a big time and effort commitment, and as hard as it is to lift heavy as an advanced lifter, the discomfort of going from a mostly sedentary lifestyle to lifting as a beginner is arguably harder, and that's for someone who's not mentally conditioned yet either. So that's why so many beginners are so interested in science, and they put it on such a pedestal. They want conclusiveness so they can commit instead of doubting themselves each time they skip out on something they enjoy to spend that time in the gym instead. And it's easy to say, just lift, you'll grow. But when you're trying to get the most out of lifting and you don't know if muscle growth is caused by muscle damage, mechanical tension, or the pump, how are you supposed to be fully bought into what you're doing? It's rational to doubt what you're doing in that case. If you guess that muscle damage causes growth, then it's going to be tough to make good progress on any muscle group trained at the end of a session with those extremely high volume amounts. If you guess that the pump causes growth, then of course you'll be missing out on the mechanical tension. It turns into a game of whack-a-mole where you just aren't sure if you're doing what actually matters to build muscle. So if you're a beginner or you're always stuck overanalyzing, my advice to you is this. Mastery is going to override any missed variables for a while. It isn't guaranteed to get you to the best results, but it will get you growing. Pick something that you know how to do or can easily implement and become obsessed with it. Look at my niche example here. I mastered preacher curls. My technique is better than the vast majority of lifters. I know exactly how to lock my body into place where it needs to be. I know exactly how much force to apply at each point in the range of motion, and I know exactly what tempo I need to go at. The phrase, quote unquote, I could do these with my eyes closed, makes a lot of sense here. The only caveat is that preacher curls are probably really easy to do with your eyes closed. And I don't say all this to brag about how good at lifting I am or anything. I'm just saying that this is the result you can expect if you commit to something and try to master it. This brings me to my next point, which is about the finer details of training. These finer details are too subtle to measure accurately in a study. They're borderline esoteric, but it's how you actually become advanced. I want to make it clear that I'm not against science, since just lifting and observing won't teach you about how a muscle is structured at the cellular level. But I do want to make the case that exercise science will always struggle to point out things that go beyond like the basics. Sure, you could point out that it's useful to confirm the basics with science, but you can also confirm the basics with a smidge of self-confidence and basic common sense and observation skills. Putting science on a pedestal to explain these basic concepts really highlights the lack of trust we have in ourselves as critical thinkers. Let's get to the juicy part here. When looking at science from a surface level perspective, it's easy to fall in love with it. It gives you answers and can give simple head-to-head comparisons between variables while taking other variables into account to ensure accuracy. At first glance, lifting actually seems like it has too many variables to reliably observe what works in a non-scientific fashion due to the delay between stimulus and detectable progress, at least relative to something like that has instant feedback when measuring what you're trying to study. So, for example, measuring what style of shot is hardest in hockey, for example. But I can confidently say that I've been proven wrong, and seemingly subtle changes are actually pretty obvious in your results when you know what your baseline performance in the gym actually is, and you don't change a bunch of things at once, of course. Ultimately, the reason why I don't put much stock into exercise science is because it can't accurately measure finer details, and duration is crucial as progress isn't linear. Remember, your body actually changes as a lifter as time goes on, which has a legit impact on your training needs. Anyone with an experienced eye, especially coaches or bodybuilding fans competitively, you can observe the small differences in technique between your average late beginner or kind of like a plateaued intermediate lifter you see in the gym and a competitive bodybuilder. I'm not even talking about the things like general tempo, range of motion, proximity to failure, or anything that's at least a bit more objective. I mean the actual finer details, like are you accelerating or decelerating on your eccentrics? Is your setup deviating as you approach failure? These are all things you need to manage on an individual level, and that doesn't even get into things like how your body and mind change over time as a lifter. I think it's easy to overlook the mechanics of lifting and leverages, or at least view them in like through a basic lens. But this is my main gripe with science-based lifters conclusively comparing lifts through short-term studies on lifters who usually aren't very strong, but even then that's a little bit beside the point. You could probably find or create a study that concludes the cable side raise beats out the standing dumbbell side raise due to getting a more of a stretch, or even having a lengthened biased resistance profile, or at least that conclusion would be widely accepted if those latter variables were proven to be of importance. But when you look at things through a narrow lens, you fail to take into account the fact that lifts do change over time, and arguably more importantly, as you change. If you're taking the example of cable versus dumbbell side raises and putting all your stock into the resistance profile, you're missing out on variables that may be equally or more important, or at least act as the asterisk that flew under the radar with the conclusion. In this case, I'd make the argument that with cable side raises, they would actually lose out in kind of the extreme, but still the long term, to dumbbell side raises due to the lack of an opposing force as you get stronger. Think about it. When you're measuring an 8-week study on beginners or generally weaker lifters, raising 10 pounds to your side when you weigh in the upper hundreds is easy and stable. But what about when you're a leaner, more muscular, and stronger lifter, raising 40 pounds to the side at that same weight? Now, there are new variables that didn't exist in that 8-week study, or at least weren't of relevance because the scope was too narrow. The point I'm trying to make here is that things change over time. If you're a lifter, your path to getting your best physique isn't linear, so it's in your best interest to know the limitations of not only science, but previous beliefs you held as well. And since I gave a weight ratio example, here's a more anatomical example to further my point. To preface this, I do believe that we're all much more similar than the fitness industry generally leads you to believe. I put much less stock into genetics than most, and I put much more stock into lifestyle than most. For example, when people talk about their genetic starting point as a lifter, a lot of the time that's actually much more closely related to their lifestyle starting point than it is a genetic thing. This may come as a surprise, but the skinny kid with the bad genetics wasn't actually just quote unquote naturally skinny. He was skinny because of his lifestyle. The fitness industry almost acts like up until you start lifting, your body is just in its natural state, but your body is always a reflection of your lifestyle, then through the filter of genetics, whether you lift or not. Once you start lifting, the habits you have will dictate what strong and weak points you develop. What you start off doing actually has a pretty big impact on what you'll need to correct down the road. And I'm not saying this in like a fear-mongering way. I'm just saying this is like the reality of your journey as a lifter. For example, if you start lifting and your buddy tells you to only focus on retracting your scaps anytime you do a pulling movement, you'll end up trap dominant and your lat focused movements will be taken over by the traps. So when you're an intermediate, you're now at a crossroads with your trap and lat development. Do you keep going on pull-ups for your lats even though your traps take over, your legs kick forward, your back rounds, your chest caves in, and your scaps upwardly rotate and your shoulders elevate, and all you feel is forearm and bicep fatigue and a little bit of trap fatigue after the set? Or does it make more sense to try out pullovers or some single arm neutral grip diagonal pulls? Cable overhead extensions are also one of the most popular lifts I see, but I rarely see anyone with an impressive long head of the triceps doing these. Of course, it will happen every now and then, but I feel like I see people doing these a lot, and I don't see that many impressive tricep long heads out there. Logically, this lift makes sense. They fully lengthen the tricep long head, so they're getting a massive range of motion and a big stretch. How could they not grow from these? When you look into it a bit further, here's how it usually goes in practice. Most lifters start off with loads of pressing in their programs when they're a beginner. Usually bench press, other pressing variations, a lot of overhead press variations, and the most common tricep movement you'll see is just cable basic pushdowns, kind of trained half-heartedly with a few reps in reserve at the end of the session. With training like this, you'll end up with strong pecs, front delts, and the lateral head of the triceps will be quite developed for now. After a few months or years, you notice that your long head is lagging and your arms look a little small from the side. So everyone online and everyone you know in person tells you that overhead extensions are the way to go. But when you try them in practice, you notice that nothing really changes despite doing them for weeks on end. They feel maybe a little bit off, but they kind of feel okay. But you don't trust your instincts over the powerful consensus of the fitness industry. If we were to look at why they're not working like you thought they would, it's pretty simple. You have an overdeveloped lateral and medial head of the triceps due to your training history, and your front delts are overdeveloped as well due to all of your pressing. When you go to do a cable overhead extension, you have a hard time even getting your shoulders into deep flexion and getting your elbows up that high, to put it simply, to get into that position you need to get in. As you lower the weight, not like decrease the weight, but go throughout the eccentric, your elbows flare out way to the side and in front of you a bit, and you can kind of feel your shoulder and scap positioning shifting around throughout the movement. What's happening here is your stronger portion of the triceps, the lateral and medial heads, and even the front delts to an extent, are turning it into more of a kind of overhead pressing, like an overhead JM press almost style of movement. The long head is biarticular, so it shortens at the shoulder as your shoulder extends and your elbow flexes. Naturally, your body does this by allowing your elbows to track forwards, which you're seeing in this case, so it can hide the weakness of the long head and recruit the stronger medial and lateral head and some front delts to execute the movement, and your weakness remains weak and you blame it on genetics. I'm not saying genetics have no role here, but a lot of the time what seems to be genetically determined can be explained through training history and lifestyle habits. If we use the same example, but take someone who started off on a program that prioritized something like pullovers and was very minimal in its presses, you might actually end up with an overdeveloped long head of the triceps. So when that person uses overhead extensions, it makes what was already a strong point even stronger since it's a more natural movement for that lifter. There are countless examples of this in lifting. And it can be a little overwhelming, but it should also be a little empowering too to know that you're in more control of your physique than you may have previously thought. A point I often see made in lifting discussions is that a certain lift or variable will only give you X% more growth. Like just for a quick example here, like I will say preacher curls the best lift there is for biceps, and someone will say, well, that's not true. Maybe it gives you 5% more growth than a barbell curl. But in reality, examples like these are why you can't measure any training variable in a percentage increase or decrease method, since things change over time. If we were to look at tricep pushdowns versus the JM press in this example, for a beginner, a tricep pushdown would usually be the better option because it's highly stable, and anatomically it would get more tricep growth due to the long head recruitment being higher than it would on a JM press, as the long head, like I said in the previous example, is biarticular. But once you're stronger, a pushdown is much less stable, especially if you're leaner, and a JM press remains equally stable, so you could argue that the difference in stability would override the decrease in long head activation, and the JM press is now better for the same lifter a couple years down the road. And if strength and size had no limit, which is a fair argument to be made, you could say that a pushdown would eventually be nearly impossible to do for any amount of stimulus, at least, once you're at a certain level of strength and size. Of course, that's an extreme example, but it makes my smaller scale case a little bit more clear. I recently heard a quote, "Common sense is just culture in disguise." That general idea applies to science-based lifting pretty well. I'd rephrase it along the lines of, science-based lifting is just trends in disguise. Exercise science, which initially started out as a way to explain the mechanisms behind what we already know, was weaponized to prey on people's apprehension to potentially train suboptimally by appealing to authority, and is morphed into a cult-like sphere where people push their claims and practices so far beyond what the science has even revealed, and that in itself proves that science isn't as conclusive as we want to believe it is. I'll leave you with this. The only reliable study outcomes can really be done on things that we didn't really need science to prove initially, so there is very little upside here and a lot of room for error. This is why you see these wild volume studies, for example. You could easily make the case that if we just never scientifically studied volume, people would have had better results a few years ago when that study was very popular. In a world where we've gotten so conditioned to submit to authority, trust the science, and trust the experts at all costs, you'll subconsciously be seeking out science as your solution for peace of mind as you train. I'm not here to burst your bubble, but I want you to know that the science we have just isn't going to make a positive impact on your training. And before you say training hard is science-based, etc., I'm not denying that science came to those conclusions. It's just disingenuous to pretend that we didn't know those things prior to those studies. My goal in this video is to prove that lifting is an art form that requires a strong mix of critical thinking, observation, and most importantly, patience.